As an international network of audit, tax, and consulting professionals, RSM International is fortunate to work with some of the world's most knowledgeable and experienced business experts and middle market business leaders. Leading Through Change is a series of talks designed to share valuable insight to help business leaders anticipate, plan, innovate, or respond to change, whether through disruption, crisis, or business transformation. Jason Clarke is the Director of Minds at Work, a commercial collective of autonomous thinkers and problem solvers dedicated to supporting anyone interested in making things better. Their mission is to help people think, and their work has involved them in some form or another in just about every government department, many not-for-profit organizations, and some of the largest corporations on the planet. Since 2000, Jason has been helping everyone from tiny startups to giant corporations transform their business by turning cynicism into optimism, inertia into action, and inspiring and harnessing the passion and talent of their people. In his work, Jason helps leaders question the orthodox and explore the unorthodox to discover a clarity of purpose and direction that inspires and empowers people to overcome obstacles, get out of their silos, and focus their diverse talents and experience to achieve a common goal.
Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. I want to talk about surfing the waves of change. My idea is that the future is not as random as it seems. Change is tidal, and there are patterns here that we can see if we're prepared to have a look. You know, they say that no one can ever really know the future, but I'm not quite so sure that that's true. Let me tell you what I mean. When I was 6, I saw Bluetooth technology, something that wouldn't be invented for another 36 years. It would not be until 2002 that someone would walk down the street wearing the device that I watched Lieutenant Uhura use on the Starship Enterprise. And I guess the thing is that time frame, that delay between a fantasy, a fiction, and the reality, that 36 years is about right. I mean, very often what we think of as being the future is an idea that someone had, just an idea or a story, and then smart people, engineering types perhaps, thought, oh, why can't we take that idea from fiction and turn it into a real thing? And by the time they've built it, designed it, and tested it, it's in the shops. 3 decades later, we're all buying it. But I guess the point is, I got a sneak preview of what was to come. And that's not the only one. I was a huge fan of the Adam West Batman, what I still think of as being, you know, the real Batman. And he got around in the Batmobile. The 1966 Batmobile had a car phone and a GPS system. Again, I'm looking at those things when I was 6 years old. I wouldn't see them out in the world until I'm 30 or 40. I had a sneak preview of what was coming. Someone imagined the future long before it got here. 2 years later, I was watching 2001: A Space Odyssey. Yes, okay, I was a sci-fi nut. But at 8 years old, I'm looking at what is really the iPad. And not only did it predict how the iPad would work, the film showed us how we would be ignoring each other over meals. It really showed us not just what the technology would do, but how people would behave in response. And it's kind of interesting because that insight I've managed to trace back to a Punch cartoon in 1906. A man and a woman in a park. The woman is exchanging information through her wireless radio with her friends, and the man is looking at the progress of a race. And what's interesting is that I can see that happen in any park on any weekend, almost exactly the way that it was predicted 100 years before. The first time when Motorola was experimenting with the flip phone, the one that they came up with in 1989 didn't sell at all well. People just weren't captured by it. It didn't look right. It didn't feel right. And the experts at MIT said the problem is you've created something that doesn't look like the future. The phone really should flip up. And they took their advice and produced the phone in 1996, and it went crazy. People couldn't get enough of it. And Motorola asked MIT, how could you be so sure that something that didn't exist didn't look like the future, that we built it wrong? And their argument was 3 generations of people have been watching William Shatner flip open his Star Trek communicator. That's what the future looked like. You know, TV and science fiction gave us a preview. And in fact, the first time I ever saw an Apple Watch, it was on the wrist of a man in his 90s who's referred to it as his Dick Tracy watch, because his boyhood hero, Dick Tracy, had pretty much the same device back in the 1930s. So some people have had some insights into some of the future, and the more we pay attention to those insights, the more of a sneak preview, some clues we get of coming attractions. And yet look at the current situation we're in. We have a global pandemic that our governments and our authorities are telling us is unprecedented and unpredictable. But can it be unprecedented if it's already happened several times in human history, as recently as 100 years ago? And can it really be said to be unpredictable if virologists and epidemiologists have been warning us about exactly this situation? They've been talking about that for decades. So how is it that anyone can see any part of the future at all? Well, as I told you earlier, change is a wave. So let's talk about waves and think about waves. Any business studies graphs. The sort of thing you've got up right here. You can see what's going up, what's going down, what's trending quickly, what's dying off slowly. We all interpret the future by looking at these graphs about the market, about technology, about anything. And I think that what these graphs tell me is that we all intuitively think of change as something that comes in waves. It has peaks and it has troughs. It has high tides and low tides. And if we understand how to read those waves, perhaps we could surf on some of them to take us to the future that we would want to create. So think about the marketplace. When we talk about how does the market behave, well, it's up and down. It's cyclical. There's a bull market followed by a bear market followed by a bull market. And you can get quite easily hypnotized by something that's that rhythmic and that predictable. In corporations, the business strategy is to diversify and then to consolidate and then to diversify again and consolidate again. You can see that there's a very predictable wave pattern there. And if you can't see what's next, I really don't know where you're not paying attention. Leadership, we move from have a visionary CEO, and then we get rid of that one and we bring in a fiscal conservative who runs the business for a while, and then we replace them with another visionary. You can see the cycles here. The economy booms and then it busts and then it booms and then it busts. World politics, there's revolution followed by reformation, globalism followed by nationalism. They say that the history doesn't repeat, but it kind of rhymes. After a while, you start to see some pretty familiar patterns. When I work with farmers, their cycle is really to do with the weather. Their primary concern is drought, and if it's not drought, it's flood. And so depending on what time of year you talk to them, they're really talking about one part of a very predictable wave. And I was working with one group of farmers years ago, and they were in the midst of a pretty savage drought, and they weren't prepared to consider the long-term future of their communities and their farms because they were waiting for it to rain. And then, and I don't know why this happened and I can't take credit for it, during the break, it rained. There was a big, heavy downpour. And the farmers went out and they put their face in the rain and they laughed. I think one of them sang, one of them danced. They were so happy. Suddenly, the drought had broken. And when they came back into the session to talk about the future, they didn't want to talk about the drought. The drought was old news. And the conversation moved to things which were bigger, more important, longer term, more significant changes. The farmers are getting too old to run the businesses. The businesses are consolidating. The costs of running the farm are not matching the profit of having the farm. And the kids who are going to be the next generation, the future of the farm, they're leaving. They're leaving the country town and not coming back. And so look what happened. The minute we stopped talking about the daily pattern or the yearly cycle, we started to concentrate on larger issues, things that perhaps we should have been paying attention to all along. Just for kicks, I was interested in what the big news stories were before the virus. So just looking back a couple of months when we weren't talking about COVID-19, what were we talking about? What were the big news stories? Well, there was elections. We talked about who was going to win the US primaries. We talked about election cycles all around the world. We talked about there were protests, anti-government protests, city protests, again, very cyclical. We talked about conflicts in war zones that have just been incredibly repetitive, just a repeating cycle. And then also we were talking about, in my country and others, the wildfires, the bushfires, terrible things, terrible disasters, but something that happens pretty much to a schedule the same time every year. We're talking about something much bigger, much more important, that we could have kept an eye out for if we weren't distracted by small things. So part of the challenge, I think, if you want to see the future, is you've got to look up from business as usual and see what else is out there. So I guess the trick is knowing what waves should we pay attention to and which should we ignore. So think about waves that are fast and small, things that like the hottest new thing, the new sensation, the brand new management tool, the brand new personality profiling prototype, the new leadership theory. I've been consulting to business now for 30 years, and whenever there's a brand new technique or a new thing I need to look at, I do a little bit of research and find that it was an idea from the 80s that has simply been rebadged. Those things, those rapid in and out, up and down, hot and not type things, they're kind of a little bit like, Korean pop music. They come out of the blue. They just take over the world. They absolutely dominate everything. And then, fortunately, they disappear as quickly as they came. You know that those fast, small movements, they're irrelevant. They're trivial. Forget about the small waves. They're just ripples. They're just distractions. What about slow, small waves? Think about the changes that come out of governments or institutions or religions. We look to these organizations for leadership, and it takes a long time before they make any stand on anything. And arguably, by the time they do speak up, say, here's the future, was it really worth waiting for? I saw an amazing presentation by the president of the World Bank. He said that if you think about the change that happens in the world, whether it's environmental, social, technological, it's like that. It's this exponential wave. You can see the thing getting faster and faster and faster. But if you compare that to the change that you see within institutions, it's incremental, it's slow, it's pedestrian. And it's funny, I was at an environmental conference and they were talking about the impacts of climate change and the accelerated change in our environment and the slow, incremental progress that was made by government agencies and institutions. And someone got up and said, you have to understand that if you're trying to create change in a political environment, you have to expect change that is glacial. And one of the environmentalists said, have you seen the glaciers lately? Something that used to be the symbol for slow is now traveling faster than the thing that's supposed to protect them. When that happens, it means you have a backlog of problems, issues that are going to face in the future that we should have solved way back in the past. So that's what happens when you have small change.